There is a fatal arrogance in a parasite that believes it has outgrown the host. It forgets that the blood keeping it alive is a privilege, not a right. And when you finally cut the vein, the starvation that follows is entirely of their own making. Welcome to Dad's Unseen Rules. I am the voice in the dark, the architect of consequences, and the father who stopped negotiating with disrespect. Today's lesson is about the illusion of power. It is a story of how a carefully built cage of generosity can become a psychological prison for those who mistake kindness for weakness. Sit down. Listen closely. My name is Gerald. I am 66 years old. For 32 years, I ran a plumbing and HVAC business in Columbus, Ohio. I built it from a single truck into an empire that fed 23 families. I am a man who understands leverage systems and the precise amount of pressure required to burst a pipe. I do not apologize for my success. My wife, Patricia, stood beside me through every brutal week until cancer took her. The grief almost dismantled me, but I survived. I sold the business. I accumulated wealth. Not extravagant wealth, but enough quiet, dangerous capital to shape reality. My son Marcus was the only piece of my original world left standing. When his new wife, a woman who climbed the social ladder with claws disguised as manicured nails, began altering his DNA, I watched. I watched as the temperature in his home grew cold. She was polite in the beginning. She smiled. She complimented my pot roast. She played the dutiful daughter-in-law perfectly. It was a transaction and I knew it, but I allowed the game to play out. Over 3.5 years, I constructed an invisible architecture of dependency around them. It started with the car. Her ego demanded a luxury SUV to impress her colleagues at the marketing firm. Marcus came to me sheepish and hovering, asking without asking. I took over the payments. $480 vanished from my account on the 3rd of every month. Then came the kitchen. $32,000 for quartz countertops and farmhouse sinks. I handed over $22,000 from my own savings. Then his doomed consulting business. He prioritized doormen and heavy business cards over actual work. When it bled dry, I co-signed a $40,000 line of credit. In total, I flooded their lives with over $140,000. Now understand the psychology here. To them, I was an endless well. A naive, grieving widower buying his way into his son's new, sophisticated life. But they failed to realize one fundamental rule of human nature. Capital is never free. Every dollar I transferred, every receipt I filed was a psychological anchor. I was giving them enough rope to build their own empire of glass. I wanted to see if the money would make them grateful, or if it would make them arrogant. They chose arrogance. The shift was a masterclass in slow-drip alienation. My daughter-in-law's performative laughter ceased. My chair at Sunday dinners was subtly relocated from the center of the room to the periphery. The invitations dried up. Her parents, Atlanta socialites living a carefully curated illusion, entered the picture. They looked at me not as a man who built a legacy, but as a dirty-handed contractor allowed into the manor by mistake. They spoke in coded language about lifestyle alignment and family culture. I heard the underlying hostility. I cataloged every slight. I did not react. A master chess player does not scream when a pawn insults him. He simply plans the board's annihilation. The catalyst arrived on a Tuesday in October. I was in my garage organizing tool. The physical repetition clears the mind for strategic thought. My phone rang. It was Marcus. He spoke with a carefully engineered voice. The voice of a coward managing a threat. He said Thanksgiving was going to be different this year. He said his in-laws were flying in with very particular ideas about the holiday. And then he delivered the kill shot. He suggested it would be better if I celebrated separately. Perhaps with my brother. Perhaps at a restaurant. I stopped moving. The garage was entirely silent. Marcus, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat, are you telling me I am not welcome at your Thanksgiving table? He stumbled. He begged me not to make it hard. He babbled about in-law expectations. He said his wife needed a stress-free environment. He said he was sure I understood. He expected a father's rage. He expected tears. He expected guilt trips and desperate pleas to see his family. He expected a reaction he could manage and subsequently dismiss as the erratic behavior of an old, lonely man. I denied him all of it. I gave him nothing to hold on to. "I understand," I said. And I hung up the phone. I did not throw the phone. I did not weep. I stared at Patricia's old gardening gloves hanging on the wall. I thought of the Thanksgiving she hosted, the burnt rolls, the laughter. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my daughter-in-law. It read, "Gerald, I hope you understand this is nothing personal. Mom and Dad just have a very specific vision for the holiday. We'll celebrate with you soon, I promise. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." The ultimate coward's shield. In that precise second, the father who mourned his son's distance vanished. What replaced him was the architect, the businessman who understood how to dismantle a failing enterprise. They believed they held all the cards because they controlled the social calendar. They forgot who owned the table, who bought the house, and who funded the cars they drove to their high society dinners. I walked into my kitchen. I made a black coffee. I sat down at the table where I had once laughed with my family. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a heavy ink pen. I did not feel betrayal. I felt the cold, mechanical clarity of an apex predator realizing the prey has just willingly walked into a dead end. I began to write down numbers, dates, account balances. The game of pretending was over. The era of unconditional love was officially terminated. It was time to introduce my son and his new family to the dark, inescapable gravity of consequences. The kitchen was silent. It was the kind of heavy, absolute silence that follows a fundamental shift in reality. Most men in that moment would have reached for a bottle. They would have called a friend to complain, seeking validation for their wounded pride, and begging for someone to tell them they were wronged. I did neither. Emotion is a liability when you are preparing for war. Anger makes you sloppy. Sadness makes you weak. I reached for my yellow legal pad and a heavy ink pen. Writing things down is the alchemy of power. It takes the abstract, messy pain of betrayal and crystallizes it into cold, hard data. When you put a number on a page, it stops being a feeling and becomes a weapon. And I was building an arsenal. The first item I wrote down was the car payment. $480. A sum I had been quietly transferring for 2 years and 4 months. That was $13,440. I wrote the figure in the margin, underlining it twice. This was the chariot my daughter-in-law used to parade her false status. Every leather seat, every chrome accent was subsidized by the man she had just deemed culturally incompatible for her holiday table. The second item was the line of credit. $40,000. The grace period was still active, but my signature was the only thing preventing the bank from swallowing my son's pathetic excuse for a consulting firm. I wrote down the balance. The third item was the kitchen renovation. $22,000. I could not extract that money. It was already baked into her farmhouse sink and quartz countertops. But I wrote it down anyway. You must document the unrecoverable losses to remind yourself why the enemy deserves no mercy. Human nature is fundamentally flawed. We are wired to forgive, to rationalize the abuse inflicted by our own blood. My son was relying on that biological weakness. He assumed the title of son provided diplomatic immunity against all treason. I needed the ink on this yellow pad to serve as an anchor, a permanent record of their entitlement, so that when the inevitable apologies came, and they always come when the money stops, I would not waver. I stared at the numbers. $147,000 of pure, unadulterated leverage. There is a specific, intoxicating power in dismantling someone's life through pure administrative silence. I did not need to shout. I did not need to drive to their house and hurl insults from the driveway. I simply picked up the phone. I called my bank. The representative on the other end was a woman with a practiced, efficient voice. She navigated the menus, locating the automatic transfer to my son's financing account. Scheduled for the 3rd of every month, she noted. She asked if I wanted to cancel it. Yes, I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's scalpel. Effective immediately. She processed the cancellation with a few keystrokes. No fanfare. No dramatic music. Just the quiet click of a digital padlock snapping shut. I thanked her and disconnected. In less than 3 minutes, I had severed the main artery of their automotive pride. They were driving a ghost, a vehicle that would soon become a financial anchor dragging them to the bottom of their own pretension. It is a terrifying thing to realize that the lifestyle you project to the world is entirely dependent on the grace of the man you just discarded. I was returning them to their actual baseline. Let the wealthy Atlanta in-laws fund the chrome and the leather if they were so deeply concerned with appearances. Then I called my attorney, Douglas, a man who has navigated the murky waters of human greed for 3 decades. I explained the situation with the precise detachment of a general reviewing a battlefield map. I outlined the Thanksgiving call. I detailed the co-signed line of credit. I did not ask for sympathy. I asked for maximum legal exposure protection. Douglas understood the assignment immediately. He knew my son. He knew the financial trajectory of a man trying to buy a personality. He outlined the exact legal maneuvers required to freeze my liability, ensuring that when the consulting business inevitably imploded, the shrapnel would only hit Marcus and his wife. He warned me that this would trigger immediate, undeniable financial distress for them. A lesser man might have hesitated at that warning. A lesser man might have felt a twinge of parental guilt, a desire to soften the blow. I felt nothing but the hard, undeniable satisfaction of a system functioning exactly as designed. Start the paperwork, I instructed. Consider it done, Gerald, he replied. I hung up the phone. The architecture of their ruin was complete. I had not fired a single shot, yet they were already bleeding out. They just didn't know it yet. I walked into the kitchen, made myself a turkey sandwich, and sat in my living room. I reclined in my chair and turned on the television. Ohio State was playing Michigan, a classic rivalry. I watched the game with absolute undisturbed focus. I want you to understand the psychology of this moment. Most people believe revenge is about dramatic confrontation. They think it's about standing in the rain, screaming at the people who wronged them, demanding an explanation. That is amateur behavior. True Machiavellian retaliation requires immense patience. It requires the discipline to set the trap, bait the hook, and walk away. You do not chase the mouse. You let the mouse find the cheese. I knew exactly what was going to happen. The 3rd of the month would arrive. The automatic transfer would fail to materialize. The bank would send a quiet automated notice. But people like my son and his wife, people who live entirely on the fumes of other people's money, they do not check their accounts meticulously. They assume the safety net is permanent. They believe the ground will always be there to catch them because I had always been the ground. I calculated it would take them at least 5 days to notice the missed payment. 5 days of them driving that luxury SUV, sipping expensive lattes, smiling at their wealthy Atlanta in-laws, utterly oblivious to the fact that their financial foundation had just been vaporized. I watched the football game, chewing my sandwich slowly. The house was quiet, save for the roar of the stadium crowd on the screen. I felt a profound sense of peace. The kind of clean, sterilized peace that only comes when you stop pretending a parasite is a pet. Let them have their stress-free Thanksgiving. Let the father-in-law pontificate over his carved turkey about his commercial real estate empire. Let the mother-in-law adjust her pearls and curate her perfect, sophisticated gathering. They were celebrating a victory in a war I had already won. As the final whistle blew on the television screen, I smiled. A cold, brief smile in the empty room. The invisible timer was ticking down. The oxygen was slowly, methodically draining from their carefully curated world. And the most beautiful part of it all, when they finally started gasping for air, they would have no one to blame but their own insatiable arrogance. The silence of a severed lifeline is not immediate. It takes time for the rot to travel from the root to the branches. For 5 days I lived in the quiet satisfaction of a man who has watched the trap spring shut, knowing the prey simply hasn't felt the steel yet. 5 days of my son and his wife driving a luxury vehicle that was rapidly morphing into a financial cinderblock. They paraded around Columbus, utterly oblivious to the fact that their foundation had been quietly vaporized. It took until the 8th of the month for the bank's automated systems to finally pierce their bubble of arrogance. The phone rang at 6:47 in the evening. I was in the middle of preparing my dinner. I let it ring twice before answering, setting the rhythm of the engagement. It was Marcus. He was not using his careful, managed voice. The velvet gloves were off, replaced by a tremor of genuine, undisguised panic. "Dad, there's been a mistake with the car payment. It didn't go through." His words were rushed, desperate to frame this as an administrative error rather than a deliberate execution. "No mistake," I replied, my tone flatter than a sheet of glass. "I canceled it." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the sudden, terrifying realization that the ground had vanished beneath his feet. "What do you mean you canceled it?" he stammered. "I mean the automatic transfer is terminated. The payment will not be arriving anymore." I could hear the cognitive dissonance fracturing his mind. He tried to argue. He claimed I had promised to help with the car. I reminded him, with glacial patience, that I had helped for 2 years, but the terms of our arrangement had fundamentally changed the moment he told me I was a liability at his Thanksgiving table. "I don't fund households that exclude me," I stated clearly. He attempted a classic manipulation tactic, trying to separate the financial from the emotional. He insisted the holiday dinner was merely a scheduling issue, completely disconnected from my money. That is the delusion of the entitled. They believe your resources are their birthright, entirely divorced from their behavior. "The money and the respect are connected," I told him. "You cut one, you cut the other." He began to spiral, calling me unreasonable, accusing me of punishing his wife. And then, in a desperate bid for emotional leverage, he invoked his mother. He claimed Patricia would never have behaved this way. I shut him down with surgical precision. I told him never to use her name to justify his cowardice, and that his mother would have been at my side from the first phone call. I told him to find his own solution to the car, and I hung up the phone. The first wave of the assault was repelled, but I knew the real architect of this situation was about to show her face. The second call came less than an hour later. It was my daughter-in-law. The polite charity event voice she used to extract $22,000 for her farmhouse sink was entirely gone. What replaced it was her actual voice. Sharp, venomous, and dripping with the kind of aristocratic contempt that usually stays hidden behind country club doors. She immediately launched into an aggressive gaslighting campaign. She accused me of throwing a child's tantrum. She claimed I was intentionally destroying my son's credit over a minor holiday dispute. This is a foundational tactic in dark psychology. When the parasite is denied its host, it will always attempt to frame the host as the abuser. They must convince themselves that your boundaries are acts of aggression. Otherwise, they would have to face their own parasitism. I let her speak. I let her empty her magazine of insults. A wise man never interrupts his enemy when they are revealing their true nature. Every word she spoke was a strategic vulnerability. She told me her parents were important people with certain standards, and that my exclusion was simply the reality of their expectations. I pressed her on this. I demanded she define these expectations. Cornered, she resorted to the oldest weapon of the insecure elite, class warfare. She spoke of lifestyle alignment, of people with similar backgrounds, formal education, and cultural exposure. She relayed her father's private assessment that I dominated conversations and made them uncomfortable. I listened to this woman, a woman whose life I was heavily subsidizing, explain to me that I was essentially too unrefined, too blue-collar to break bread with her pedigree family. I reminded her that I built a business from nothing and employed 23 people before her father even knew my name. She dismissed it all. She said I made everything about money because I lacked the upbringing to handle social nuance gracefully. And then she made the fatal error. The single unforgivable miscalculation that guaranteed her absolute destruction. She said, "Gerald, Patricia understood how to be gracious about her position. I always respected that about her. She never made anyone feel uncomfortable by reminding them of what she'd given up." I stood frozen in my kitchen. The air in the room suddenly felt cold and thin. I spoke slowly, measuring every syllable so the warning would bypass her ego and lodge directly in her survival instincts. "Do not speak about my wife." She attempted to backtrack, claiming she was just making a point. "You made it," I said. "Don't make another one." I terminated the call. I stared at the shelf above my refrigerator, at the wooden box holding Patricia's handwritten recipe cards. The words hung in the air like a toxic vapor. Her position? The position of a woman who bled and sacrificed to build an empire from a single truck? What gracious acceptance was my daughter-in-law hallucinating? In that moment, any lingering shred of paternal mercy I might have harbored evaporated entirely. Narcissists always overplay their hand. By attacking my sanctified dead, she removed all of my moral constraints. The game was no longer about teaching a lesson. It was about total, undeniable ruin. The next morning, I called Douglas and ordered him to accelerate the paperwork on the $40,000 line of credit. I told him what she had said about Patricia. He was silent for a long moment before telling me that he believed I knew exactly what I was doing. I did. Over the next 2 weeks, I transformed my office into a war room. I gathered every single bank statement dating back to the first car payment. I pulled the receipts for the kitchen renovation, the financing documents, the emails where my son had outlined the terms of the business loans. I printed everything. I organized it chronologically, highlighting the specific dollar amounts, ensuring the math was impossible to misinterpret. Mathematics is the ultimate antidote to gaslighting. Numbers do not have emotions. Numbers do not care about your cultural exposure. Numbers are absolute. I also began my counterintelligence. I researched her father. I found his name in the Atlanta commercial real estate directories, mapping his committee positions and his fragile social infrastructure. I studied her mother's curated online presence. I understood exactly what they valued: reputation, appearance, and the illusion of superiority. What I was building was not a weapon of physical violence or emotional outburst. I was building a counter-narrative constructed entirely of raw, irrefutable data. An armor-piercing dossier designed to shatter their polished social masks. They had decided to play a game of shadows and implications. I was preparing to turn on the floodlights and let the gravity of their own greed crush them. When a man of perceived high status realizes he has been outmaneuvered by someone he considers his social inferior, he will never engage in open combat. Open combat requires equal footing, and his entire ego is built on the illusion that you are not his equal. Instead, he will retreat to the shadows. He will weaponize his network. He will attempt to assassinate your character before you have the opportunity to expose his lack of one. This is the oldest Machiavellian play in the aristocratic handbook: discredit the witness before the witness takes the stand. They decided to go public, but they did it with the cowardly, sterile precision of the country club elite. It did not begin with a confrontation. It began with a sudden, localized drop in atmospheric pressure. I noticed a quiet drift of recalibrated opinions among the men I had known for decades through Columbus business associations. Men I had worked with, men whose commercial plumbing disasters I had fixed at 2 a.m, suddenly found themselves with less time for coffee. Conversations at the hardware supplier became awkwardly brief. Then, an annual industry luncheon event I had been informally but consistently invited to for the past decade occurred. My invitation simply did not materialize. I might have dismissed these anomalies as the natural fading of a retired man's relevance. But I do not believe in coincidence. Coincidence is a comforting lie we tell ourselves to avoid seeing the predator in the tall grass. Confirmation arrived via a phone call from Ray. Ray was my fishing buddy. More importantly, Ray was a careful man. He did not traffic in gossip unless the gossip was carrying a loaded weapon. He called me on a Thursday, his voice tight, measuring his words as if navigating a minefield. He told me that he had been hearing things through the grapevine regarding my mental state since the sale of my business. The narrative being aggressively, yet delicately, pushed was that the grief of losing Patricia had finally caught up with me, that I had become erratic, unreliable, prone to destructive outbursts, that my son Marcus was genuinely worried about my declining cognitive health. I listened to Ray with a cold, almost detached admiration for the enemy's strategy. My son's father-in-law, the Atlanta commercial real estate baron, had played his card. He had tapped into his vast networks of similarly hollow men, using his practiced corporate cadence to plant seeds of doubt. He did not make accusations, he made implications. He did not attack me, he expressed deep, patrician concern for my well-being. It was a brilliant clinical form of social gaslighting. If I reacted angrily to the rumors, I would only prove them right. I would look erratic and unstable. If I stayed silent, the cancer would spread, and my 30-year reputation in Columbus would be reduced to the tragic story of a grieving, crazy old man. He was trying to build a quarantine zone around me. He wanted to ensure that when the financial collapse of his daughter's household finally became public knowledge, my explanation would be dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a senile father. It was a good move, but he made one catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed I was playing defense. I thanked Ray, assured him my mind was sharper than it had been in 20 years, and hung up the phone. I returned to my war room. I looked at the stacks of paper, the bank transfers, the receipts, the signed contracts. The father-in-law had fired the first shot in the shadow war. He had used whispers. I was going to use artillery. There is a gathering my son and his wife host every year in late November. It is a post-Thanksgiving dinner designed specifically for their close friends, their high-status Columbus connections, and her parents. It is a curated echo chamber of the people who matter to them, the people whose opinions dictate their fragile self-worth. It is a theater of status. I knew the date because Marcus had mentioned it back in January, back when I was still an acceptable, albeit silent, ATM machine. I had been told in passing that my invitation would come. Naturally, the invitation never arrived. But the date was permanently burned into my mind. I began to assemble the execution device. I took the raw data I had compiled and synthesized it into 12 identical packets. Each packet contained a 4-page summary of the past 3.5 years. The bank transfers. The farmhouse sync receipts. A copy of the $40,000 line of credit with my signature, acting as the only barrier between my son and bankruptcy. The printed, undeniable record of the luxury car payments. On top of each packet, I placed a single-page timeline. I wrote it myself. It was completely stripped of emotion. There were no accusations, no exclamation points, no dramatic narratives about broken hearts or disrespected fathers. It was purely factual, unembellished. Dates and dollar amounts arranged in strict chronological order, ending with the exact date of my Thanksgiving exclusion. When you want to destroy a narcissist, you do not use your feelings. Your feelings are exactly what they want. They can manipulate your feelings. You use cold, indifferent reality. Reality cannot be gaslighted. I placed the 12 packets into a heavy leather briefcase. I went to my closet and pulled out my good charcoal suit. It was the suit I had purchased for the retirement dinner my employees threw for me when I sold my empire. It was a suit paid for by 30 years of calluses, early mornings, and unbreakable promises. It carried the weight of a real legacy, a stark contrast to the rented, heavily financed prestige of the people I was about to face. I dressed slowly. I tied my tie. I looked at myself in the mirror. There was no anger in my eyes. Anger is impulsive. What I felt was absolute terrifying purpose. I was not driving to my son's house to cause a scene. I was driving there to deliver a verdict. The father-in-law wanted to control the narrative by whispering in the dark. I was going to walk directly into his most sacred, brightly lit room, lock the doors from the inside, and force him to choke on his own medicine in front of his entire audience. The trap had been baited. The target was isolated. It was time to pull the lever. High society is an architecture built entirely on the illusion of consensus. It relies on everyone in the room agreeing to pretend that the masks they wear are their actual faces. When you introduce raw, unvarnished truth into that environment, it does not just cause a disruption. It causes a structural collapse. My son and his wife host a gathering every year in late November. A post-Thanksgiving dinner for their carefully curated echo chamber. The high-status Columbus connections. Her parents' aristocratic friends. The people whose opinions forge their fragile reality. I had known the exact date since January. I arrived at 7:45. Dinner was in full swing. I wore my charcoal suit, the armor of a man who built his life with his own hands. In my right hand I carried a heavy leather briefcase. Inside were 12 identical packets. 12 scythes sharpened by mathematics and bank statements ready to cut down a forest of lies. The front door was unlocked. My daughter-in-law liked to project an image of welcoming energy. I appreciated the consistency. It made the infiltration completely frictionless. I stepped into the foyer. The hum of sophisticated, meaningless conversation drifted from the dining room. I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, heavy cadence of inevitable consequence. When I appeared in the archway, the conversation died. Not a slow fade. An instantaneous execution of sound. 14 people sat around the extended table. My son sat at the head. My daughter-in-law to his right. Her parents were positioned in the center, holding court like exiled royalty. The father-in-law's head snapped toward me, scanning for threats. But it was my daughter-in-law who stood up. Her chair scraped violently against the hardwood. "Gerald," she hissed, her panic masquerading as authority. "This is not appropriate. You need to leave." I ignored her. I walked to the heavy oak sideboard, the one I had helped them carry up their stairs last spring, and set the briefcase down. The metallic click of the latch's opening sounded like gunshots. "I am not here to argue," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to every corner. "I am here to ensure that the people in this room understand the actual economics of this family, before they form opinions based on second-hand whispers." The father-in-law pushed himself up, his face flushed with engineered anger. "You have no right to intrude on a private gathering." I met his eyes. I felt the very same way when I was told I wasn't welcome at my own son's Thanksgiving table. After 3.5 years of keeping the roof over it, the table stopped breathing. I reached into the briefcase, pulled out the first packet, and placed it beside the nearest guest's wine glass. I moved to the next. I did not rush. In my 30 years of business, I learned a fundamental truth. The person who moves the slowest in a panicked room controls the room. I was a metronome, ticking away their social standing. "What you are looking at," I said, continuing my slow circuit, "is a financial autopsy. $147,000. It includes bank transfers, luxury vehicle payments, a $22,000 kitchen renovation, and a co-signed commercial line of credit that is currently hemorrhaging because the borrower stopped answering my calls when his in-laws decided I was not culturally compatible with their holiday." A marketing colleague looked down at her packet. "This is all documented," she whispered. "Every receipt is dated. Every transfer has a reference number," I replied smoothly. My son's voice cracked. "Dad, you can't do this. This is private." I paused behind his chair. "It stopped being private, Marcus, when your father-in-law spent the last 3 weeks calling my professional contacts, suggesting I was mentally unstable. I built a name in this city. I will not let it be dismantled in the dark by a coward." The father-in-law's voice dropped, attempting a physical threat. "You have no idea what I am capable of." "I do now," I said, dropping a packet squarely in front of him. The mother-in-law possessed the freezing composure of a woman, equating social manners with moral victory. "Gerald, this behavior reflects terribly on your family name." The temperature in my chest dropped to absolute zero. My family name was built by 2 people who bled for everything they had. My late wife did not need anyone to explain gracious behavior to her. She lived it, in the dirt, without an audience. Recalibrate your tongue when you speak of my family. Real silence fell. The physical silence of a room sitting in a blast radius. An Atlanta connection picked up his packet looking at my son. Marcus. Is this accurate? My son's face was wet ash. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was watching his fabricated reality disintegrate in real time. Yes, the father-in-law snapped, trying desperately to plug the sinking ship. There is a dispute about contributions. Gerald has chosen to air it destructively. He forced a patronizing smile. This is what I meant. About certain people being unable to handle themselves in adult settings. Certain people. The cornerstone of his aristocratic delusion. I stepped forward, leaning on the table, invading his physical space. I dropped my voice to a lethal register. You engineered a social exclusion designed to humiliate me. You sit at a table I paid for, eating food made possible by my money. Deciding I wasn't the right kind of person, I held his eyes. So, finish the sentence. I want everyone here to hear what you mean by certain people. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. Cowards live in implications because implications can be denied. Stripped of his shadows, he was just a frightened old man in an expensive tie. An older woman, the wife of a Columbus developer, pushed her plate away in unvarnished disgust. What context, she asked aloud, changes $147,000? Checkmate. The room had turned. My son stood up. Dad, I think you should go. I picked up my empty briefcase. I looked at the ruins of a boy who sold his soul to impress people who despised his origins. I am going, I said. I love you, Marcus. Not $1 was given to buy that love. I gave it because you were my son. But what I required was basic human respect. A seat at the table. My wife's memory left alone. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, the room erupted into frantic whispers. I heard the older woman say coldly, I think the inappropriate thing happened long before tonight. I walked out into the freezing night. It felt magnificent. The war was over. The enemy had just been handed the bill. I drove home through the freezing Columbus night. The radio was off. The silence inside the cabin was immaculate. It was the distinct, sterile silence of a battlefield after the heavy artillery has ceased firing. I felt no regret. Regret is a luxury reserved for those who act out of blind emotion. I had executed a perfectly calibrated response to a deliberate psychological attack. The false structure they had built on my foundation had collapsed, and I was comfortably miles away from the falling debris. The frantic attempts at damage control began at sunrise. My daughter-in-law called twice. Her mother called once. A masked number rang 3 times. I let every single call bleed out into the void of my voicemail. In the theater of power, accessibility is a privilege. When you withdraw your presence entirely, you force the enemy to sit in the suffocating echo chamber of their own actions. Silence is not passive, it is an active, crushing weight. I drank my coffee, feeling the purposeful calm of a man who has reclaimed his territory. My son finally called that evening. I picked up on the 3rd ring, setting the tempo. When he spoke, the careful, managed voice of a man trying to appease a wealthy father-in-law was gone. What remained was the shattered cadence of a boy who had finally realized the cost of his cowardice. He told me he owed me an apology he didn't know how to articulate. I told him to start speaking, and the words would form. He confessed. He admitted he had watched his wife's attitude shift, that he had heard his in-laws' subtle, poisonous remarks about my background and education. He admitted he had said nothing because he was too weak to disrupt the illusion. I listened to his confession without offering the warm blanket of parental reassurance. Your silence, I told him quietly, was its own statement. He asked about the car. He didn't ask desperately, but with the hollow resignation of a man reading his own sentence. I gave him the only truth that mattered. I explained that the money and the respect were a singular entity. The respect had been permanently withdrawn, therefore the treasury was sealed. I instructed him to restructure the credit line, as Douglas was already removing my name from the exposure. The safety net was gone. Welcome to gravity. He paused, his voice trembling as he delivered the casualty report. The dinner last night. It stopped. Some of the people there reached out to me today. The older woman, the one with the developers, she told my wife they wouldn't be attending our events anymore. The Columbus connections had severed ties. The high society parasite had been identified and excised from the host body. I did not smile, but I acknowledged the ruthless efficiency of social self-preservation. My son finally understood. I hadn't gone there to show them I was angry. I went there to expose the fraudulent nature of their superiority. He asked if I could forgive him. I told him I already had. But Machiavellian forgiveness does not mean amnesia. I am not going back to what we had, I stated coldly. I will not sit at a table where I am tolerated instead of welcomed. If you want me in your life, it starts from the dirt up. No money. No favors. Just respect. True structural change is not born from dramatic epiphanies, it is born from survival. They sold the luxury SUV in March and bought a vehicle their actual income could support. The line of credit was restructured, legally insulating me from their impending failures. The aristocratic in-laws fled back to Atlanta in January, their social capital in Columbus completely bankrupt. Whether they retreated out of shame or simply because the cost-benefit analysis of the relationship had plummeted, I did not care. They were irrelevant ghosts. The final surrender arrived on a Tuesday in April. My son asked to bring his wife to my house. She sat at my kitchen table, the exact spot where I had drafted her ruin 6 months prior, and stared at her hands. I did not make it easy for her. I did not offer a comforting smile. I let the silence stretch until it physically hurt her. She finally broke. She admitted she had absorbed her parents' toxic worldview without questioning it. She confessed she had been profoundly wrong about me, and that weaponizing Patricia's memory was an unforgivable sin. She was asking for a chance to exist in my orbit again. Patricia, I said, my voice cutting through her tears, would have given you every chance in the world. But I am not Patricia. I am a man who measures his materials carefully, and I do not build on a foundation I cannot trust. I looked at her weeping, stripped of all her pretension. I am going to need more time, but I am not locking the door. That night we ate pot roast. My son set the table the way his mother taught him. The conversation was fragile, the careful maneuvering of survivors navigating a minefield they had laid themselves. But it was real. It was no longer a performance funded by my wallet. The moment I picked up that pen, I wasn't starting a war. I was burning down a rotting structure so something genuine could grow in its ashes. My son did not lose me when he excluded me from Thanksgiving. He was losing himself. I simply held up a mirror he could not escape, and the reflection terrified him enough to find his way back. Love is not measured by the abuse you are willing to absorb. It is defined by the rigid boundaries you are willing to enforce against those who test them. Respect is the only currency that survives the fire. If you have ever had to burn a fraudulent empire down to remind them who built the actual throne, leave a comment below. I study every single one. If you want to survive in a world entirely populated by predators and parasites, you must learn to think like the architect of the trap. Subscribe to Dad's Unseen Rules and never let them forget who holds the pen. The next lesson is waiting for you on the screen. Stay cold. Stay calculating.